There was a boy standing in line who didn't look at anyone. That wasn't unusual at the awakening ceremony. 1,000 students packed into the stone-floored hall of Xuanjing Hunter Academy, every one of them pretending they weren't terrified. Boys straightened their collars. Girls whispered final prayers. Everyone wore the same expression, that tight, fragile look of someone about to learn their fate. But the boy at the back of the line had a different kind of stillness. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't fidgeting or glancing at the testing pillar the way the others did, watching each student place their palm on the stone and waiting to see what color bloomed in the air. He just stood there, calm and unhurried, as if he'd already seen this room 100 times. His name was Suming, an orphan, no family connections, no sponsor, no coin in his account worth mentioning. The academy administrators had put him in the back of the line without thinking about it, and nobody protested, because nobody thought it mattered where someone like him stood. The students near him edged forward as the line moved, unconsciously creating a small gap around him, the way crowds sometimes do around things they've already written off. He noticed. He always noticed. But he said nothing. The pillar at the front of the hall was a 6-sided column of pale crystal, waist-high, and when a student laid their hand on it, the stone read the soul and broadcast the result to the giant board mounted on the wall. Star rating, job class, the two numbers that would define the rest of your life. A 9-star or 10-star talent meant the major guilds would already be drafting contracts before you'd walked back from the pillar. A 3-star or below meant you'd be filling out scholarship applications by nightfall, looking at a future of supply runs and low-tier dungeon grunt work, hoping to save enough to retire before a monster ended things for you. The crowd watched each result appear on the board with a kind of brutal hunger. 5 stars for a girl in a silver jacket, applause. A boy got 7. He burst into tears from relief, and his friends grabbed him, laughing. Then a boy named Jiang Tang walked to the pillar, and the board lit up with 8 stars, and the whole room inhaled at once. People were already whispering his name before he'd lifted his hand from the stone. A girl beside him with dark hair and careful eyes, Ren Xiaoman, had drawn 6 stars an hour earlier, enough to guarantee herself a mid-tier guild offer. She touched Tang's arm when he came back, and he smiled down at her, and there was something arranged about the way they stood together, something decided. Suming watched them from the back of the line and felt nothing. Or rather, he felt something, but it was old and settled, pressed down into a place he no longer visited. He had known both of them, not in this life, in the one before. The line moved. His turn came. Nobody near him was paying attention when he placed his hand on the crystal. The hall monitors were chatting at the edges of the room. Half the crowd had turned to look at a leaderboard update on the far wall. It was the back of the line. The interesting draws were already done. The pillar cracked. Not broke. Cracked. A fracture opened diagonally across its surface, hairline and sharp, and a sound came from the crystal like a single plucked string, low and resonant and entirely wrong. The board on the wall flickered. The display scrambled, showing characters that didn't exist in the rating system, then cleared itself and went dark for 3 full seconds before rebooting. When the result appeared, it read, Sword Controller, 1 star. A few people glanced over. Someone laughed at the low number. Someone else muttered about the board glitching. It hadn't done that in the 12 years the Academy had run these ceremonies. The hall monitor closest to the pillar frowned at the crack in the stone and wrote something in her notebook, then looked around for a supervisor. Suming had already stepped away. He walked back to his seat with his hands in his pockets, and the stillness around him was exactly the same as when he'd arrived. 1 star, sword controller, trash tier. Everyone who'd noticed the board flicker moved on within 30 seconds, because nothing interesting had happened, just a broken machine and a nothing result from a nobody orphan. Nobody thought to ask why a 1-star talent had cracked a testing pillar that had never shown so much as a chip in a decade. That question would take a while to surface. By the time it did, the answer would already be too late for most of them. This was Suming's second life. He had been here before. Not in this room, not in this young body, but in this world. In this brutal system where strength was everything and sentiment was a wound waiting to be opened. He had spent his first life fighting upward through a pyramid of danger and betrayal, clawing from nothing to the very top, earning power that most hunters spent entire careers dreaming about. He had reached the final gate at the end of a dungeon no one else had cleared, bleeding and exhausted and certain, for just a moment, that the people standing beside him were the reason he'd made it. He had been wrong. His best friend, Jiang Tang, The same Jiang Tang, now smiling at the pretty girl across the ceremony hall, had put a blade between his ribs from behind. His girlfriend had held him down. They took his divine artifact, the impossible weapon he had risked everything to earn, and when he looked up at their faces, there was no regret in either of them. Just calculation, just greed, just the quiet relief of people who had been waiting for the right moment and found it. He died on that dungeon floor, and then he woke up here, young again. Back at the beginning, the academy ceremony, the testing pillar, the whole long road stretching ahead of him. But this time, the divine artifact was already in his possession. It had reincarnated with him, hidden in his soul, undetectable by any normal scan. And this time, he knew the road. Every hidden quest, every rare item location, every dungeon mechanic that the guides never mentioned, every future market spike that no other hunter could see coming. He had the map, he had the cheat, he had all the time he needed. The pillar's crack had been the artifact reacting to the scan, a 10-star mythic talent contained by a 1-star disguise. The concealment skill had done its job. The board showed what he wanted it to show. Jiang Tang, across the room, had no idea that the orphan with the trash tier result was the same person he'd murdered. He would not find out gently. After the ceremony, while most students clustered in the courtyard trading scores and guild contacts, Suming slipped toward the equipment wing. He had a specific purpose. In his first life, he had wasted months scraping for funds in the early levels, working with gear that was barely adequate when better options were sitting in plain sight, if you knew where to look. The vendor stalls near the academy's south gate sold junk rocks, chunks of raw stone that might contain embedded loot or might contain nothing at all. The students who bought them were gambling. Suming wasn't. He had perfect memory of every rock in this row of stalls. He knew exactly which ones held something worth pulling. There was a boy near the stalls already, standing with 3 friends, talking loudly. His name was Yang Ding. Mid-tier family, enough coin to be careless with it, and the specific kind of confidence that came from never having been seriously tested. He was laughing about a student who'd gotten 2 stars at the ceremony, doing an impression of the boy's face when the board showed the number. His friends obliged him with laughter. He noticed Suming approach the stall. The look he gave him was immediate and instinctive. The kind of look boys like Yang Ding gave to boys like Suming without thinking about it. A quick read. Orphan. 1 star. Broke. He dismissed the assessment the moment he'd made it and turned back to his friends. Suming didn't look at him. He crouched down near the lowest shelf of the stall, where the least expensive rocks sat in a dusty row, each one marked with a coin price burned into the side. 50 coins each. The cheapest pile, the ugliest shapes. He picked one up, turned it once in his hands, and set 50 coins on the vendor's tray. Yang Ding glanced over again, and this time his expression shifted toward amusement. He told his friends loudly that the trash-tier orphan was throwing away his last coins on a garbage rock, that you couldn't teach someone to make better decisions, that some people were just born to waste what little they had. His friends laughed again. One of them asked Suming directly why he wasn't saving those coins for the dungeon entrance fee, since a 1-star sword controller was going to need every advantage he could scrape together. The suggestion landed with the weight of people who thought they were being generous with their contempt. Suming said nothing. He set the rock on the edge of the stall's counter, drew a small blade from his belt, a student issue piece, unremarkable, and tapped it against the stone's surface in 3 deliberate places. The rock split. The halves fell apart and a sword dropped from the inside, hitting the counter with a clean metallic ring that cut through Yang Ding's laughter like a cold draft. It was a straight blade, single-edged, with faint runes spiraling from the guard to the first third of the steel, and even from a few feet away the faint silver glow around the edge was unmistakable. Silver grade. A silver grade weapon sitting in a 50-coin trash rock at a street stall, which should have been impossible, which happened maybe once in several thousand pulls, which under normal circumstances no student in this entire courtyard had any business expecting. Yang Ding's face changed. The amusement drained out of it. Suming picked the sword up and turned it once, checking the stats without displaying them. He had his appraisal ability, an artifact function that worked passively and showed him item data without a visible UI that others could read over his shoulder. The sword was exactly what he'd remembered. A lifesteal blade at the top end of silver tier. The kind of weapon that would normally cost a student 3 months of dungeon income to buy outright. He set it back on the counter. Then he turned to Yang Ding for the first time. He said he was willing to make a bet. He had found a silver-grade weapon in a rock that cost 50 coins. If Yang Ding could tell him honestly that he'd expected that result when he'd watched him make the purchase, he would hand the blade over freely. But if Yang Ding admitted he'd expected nothing, which everyone in this courtyard had heard him say aloud, loudly, repeatedly, then Yang Ding would pay him 5,000 coins. The terms weren't complicated. The problem was they were airtight, because Yang Ding had spent the last 2 minutes making sure every person nearby knew exactly what he'd thought of the transaction. His friends went quiet. Yang Ding looked at the sword. He looked at his friends. He looked at the small crowd that had drifted over at the sound of the blade hitting the counter. He paid. The coin transfer registered in Su Ming's account before Yang Ding's expression had finished cycling through its stages. Su Ming pocketed the blade, nodded once, and walked away without watching Yang Ding stand in the mess of what had just happened. 5,000 coins was enough to cover his first gear purchase, his dungeon entry supplies, and the down payment on a piece of information he'd need before the week was out. He kept walking and didn't look back. The day of the awakening ceremony had one more piece of business. Su Ming had known it was coming from the moment he'd seen Ren Xiaoman in the hall, standing close to Zhang Tang with that calculated composure. He had known what she would do, because she had done it in his first life, shown up wherever he was, used warmth like a tool, kept him invested in her opinion of him. It had worked then. He had been younger, lonelier, more willing to believe that someone like her would choose someone like him without a reason. He knew the reason now. He had learned it in the worst possible way. She found him on the roof of the East Dormitory building as the afternoon light flattened out above the academy's tiled courtyard. She came up the stairs as if she'd wandered there by accident, turned when she saw him, and let her face do the work. A small softening, a careful smile, the performance of someone pleasantly surprised. She said she'd heard his result at the ceremony and wanted to check on him. She said she knew the other students had been unkind. She said that raw numbers weren't everything, that she'd always believed results weren't the full picture. Su Ming stood at the roof's edge with his back to her for a moment after she finished. He had prepared for this, but preparation didn't fully account for the specific sound of her voice doing that specific thing. The warmth calibrated to what she knew he'd respond to, shaped perfectly from years of knowing exactly what worked. In another life he'd stood in a similar moment and believed every word. The wound it left had defined the rest of that life's trajectory. He turned around. He told her plainly. He knew why she was there. He knew the 6-star result from the ceremony didn't put her in the tier she needed to attract major guild backing. Not when Zhang Tang had drawn 8 and the competition among top-tier students was already forming. He knew that a talented low-ranked student with no connections could serve as cover, someone who could look independent while being informally attached to a better-positioned student's network. He knew what the smile was for. He knew what checking on him was for. Her expression didn't break immediately, which told him how practiced the performance was. She shifted, tried warmth in a different register, tried sincerity, tried hurt feelings, and for 30 seconds she cycled through every version of the approach. He had a blade in his hand, a short knife, unsheathed quietly sometime while she'd been talking. He hadn't decided to pick it up in any deliberate way, his hands had simply done it. The way hands sometimes acted slightly ahead of a mind that had been holding something for too long. He stepped forward and cut her face. A single diagonal line across one cheek, controlled and precise, drawing blood without damage to anything beneath. She recoiled, with a sound that was shock before it was pain. Her hand went to her face. When she looked at her fingers, the blood was vivid against her pale skin. He told her not to waste his time again. She left the roof. He stood in the cooling air, cleaned the blade on the hem of his sleeve, and looked out across the academy's tiled rooftops. There was nothing he felt that needed analyzing. The cut was not rage. It was a message in the only language he was sure she would hold on to. Beauty was the currency she had built her entire operation around. The scar would remind her, every day, that he had understood her. He folded the knife away and went down to prepare for the dungeon. The beginner dungeon opened at dawn. Xuanjing Academy ran one each semester. A sealed wilderness zone generated fresh every year so that no student could cheat by sharing maps from previous runs. The layouts shifted, the monster placements rotated, the hidden rooms moved. What stayed constant were the rules: enter, kill, level up, and reach the exit before the countdown ended. The highest scoring student from each academy would claim the leaderboard's top rank, which this year mattered more than usual. Xuanjing sat in an embarrassing 5th place in the regional rankings, and Principal Wang had made it quietly clear that a strong dungeon result could change that. Students from a dozen academies were funneled through separate entry gates, then released into the same shared zone. Their scores updated on a live board that any guild scout or sponsor could view in real time. The first kill of the run, specifically the first kill of the zone's mutant boss, which appeared only once and only for a narrow window, was worth a flat bonus that could double a student's early point total. Suming had entered dungeons 100 times in his first life. He knew where the mutant boss spawned in this year's layout. He knew its movement timer. He knew that most students would spend the first 20 minutes cautiously mapping the perimeter, too uncertain to push deep, while the window for the first kill ticked toward closed. He went straight there. The dungeon's interior was a dense forest of pale stone trees, their canopies filtering what passed for sunlight into something dim and greenish. The air smelled like wet rock and something faintly metallic. Old magic, the residue of whatever system process generated the zone each year. Other students fanned out around him at the entry point, some calling to friends, some already falling into party formations. Nobody followed him into the tree line when he moved northeast without hesitation. A 1-star sword controller heading directly into the forest looked like someone making a mistake. He reached the spawn point 6 minutes ahead of any other student. The mutant was a boar type, larger than the standard variants, its hide layered with hardened protrusions that made direct frontal attacks a bad idea. In his first life, he'd watched students waste half their stamina trying to hack at the plating before someone figured out the exposed joints at the neck. He didn't need to figure anything out. He sent the sword out first, before the boar had registered his presence. The concealment skill hid his talent rating from other people's system scans, but it didn't suppress what he could actually do. The flying sword technique he'd mastered in his previous life let him control a blade at range, directing it with his mind, the way a person might direct a thrown stone, except with precision and speed that no thrown stone could match. The boar turned its head at the sound of movement in the brush, and the blade was already through the exposed joint at the base of its skull before it completed the turn. Clean. 1 strike. The beast dropped. The system notification came through a half-second later. First blood. Bonus points registered. Suming called the sword back, let it settle into the grip of his outstretched hand, and stood in the quiet for a moment. The forest around him was still. He could hear other students somewhere in the distance. The snap of branches, someone calling a name, the sharp sound of a spell being tested against a small creature. They would find the boar's corpse eventually, and the empty first kill slot on the leaderboard would tell them exactly what had happened, and nobody would know which student at which academy had done it, or how quickly. He moved on. The next hour was straightforward by his standards, though it would not have looked that way to anyone watching. The dungeon's standard enemies, goblins, mostly, with occasional stonehide lizards and a few wandering wraith types that dissolved in contact with direct light, fell quickly when you knew how they clustered and where they didn't. Then he made a deliberate choice to cut through the cavern section. It was the fastest route to the dungeon's deeper zone, but it had a trap, a pressure-triggered mob spawn buried in the floor of the main passage. Step in the wrong spot and the cavern opened like a trapdoor beneath you, spilling 100 goblins out of a pocket dimension into the corridor all at once. Most students who stumbled into it died before they processed what was happening. The handful who survived usually retreated immediately and avoided the area for the rest of the run. Suming triggered it on purpose. He stepped on the pressure plate, felt the floor shudder, and was already moving upward. A short burst from his movement skill, enough to carry him onto a jutting rock shelf 3 meters above the corridor floor. The goblins poured out below him, a churning mess of gray skin and rusted iron, yelling in their sharp, broken language and looking in every direction for the target that had woken them. He was above them. They rarely looked up. He worked methodically from the shelf, sending the sword down in controlled arcs, pulling it back, redirecting, sending it out again. Goblins couldn't climb the shelf's face. It was sheer and wet, and the ones near the back of the mob were too far from the entry point to retreat into the pocket dimension again. The mob was dense and stupid and trapped, and he had the high ground and time. It took 12 minutes to clear them. The point total was considerable. Mob spawns had multiplied XP values, so a full cavern clear pushed him ahead of anyone else on the board by a margin that wouldn't close easily. He dropped back to the corridor floor, stepped through the aftermath, and continued into the dungeon's second zone. The deeper forest was darker. The canopy closed overhead and the ambient light dropped until it was almost navigational. just enough to make out shapes at close range. There were better enemies here, higher level and more aggressive, but still well within what he could handle. He took them as they came, accumulating points steadily, and was somewhere in the third section of the zone when he heard something that wasn't combat. It was a voice, quiet and strained, trying to stay below the frequency that would draw monster attention. He followed it to a narrow ravine cut between two rock faces, where a girl was pressed against the stone wall with 3 goblins circling her. She had a healer's staff, a slim thing with a pale crystal at the tip, held in both hands, though it was clearly a support item rather than a weapon. Her clothes were torn at the shoulder. One of the goblins had gotten close. She wasn't screaming. That was the thing he noticed first. She was watching the goblins with her back to the stone, tracking their movement, calculating something, too frightened to speak, but not so frightened that she'd lost the ability to think. That particular kind of scared, the kind that stays functional, was not nothing. He dealt with the goblins quickly, the sword working ahead of him as he came around the ravine's edge, and the 3 of them dropped in the time it took her to realize someone else was there. She stared at him, then at the goblins, then at him again. Her name was Jang Yun King. She was a 7-star soul healer from a family wealthy enough to give her real equipment, and her passive aura produced an experience gain buff that affected everyone in her party radius, 200% above base rate, compounding with every kill. He had known about her in his first life, but had never worked with her. He had known she existed and that she spent most of the beginner dungeon running from things because her class was support only, not built for solo combat. He told her to keep up if she wanted protection. He said it simply, without decoration, and started walking. She scrambled to catch up. She had questions, which he answered briefly and accurately. His academy, not his class. Directions to the safer route toward the zone's midpoint. She seemed to file each answer away and ask the next one without pressing for elaboration, which he respected in a quiet way. Most people who were scared either talked constantly or went completely silent. She was doing something more useful, using the conversation to steady herself while also gathering real information. They found a hidden goblin den 20 minutes later, tucked behind a false rock wall that the dungeon's annual rotation had moved from its original position. Summing knew where it was regardless. Inside, past a squad of elite-type goblins that took more effort than the standard variants, the first real resistance he'd encountered, and he felt the edge of it in the 20 seconds where 2 of them came at him simultaneously, and he had to split the sword's attention and keep his own body out of range at the same time. Inside, there was a chest. A standard dungeon chest ran through a grade table randomly. Silver was good, gold was rare, platinum was theoretical for most students at this level. He had the Ascension talent. He opened the chest, bronze grade. He placed his hand on the lid before closing it, let the talent work, felt the brief resistance as it spent itself, and the contents shifted. He opened it again. Platinum armor, chest piece, gauntlets, boots, a full upper body set in pale metal that caught the dim light and threw it back softly. Even Yun King, who had grown up in a household where expensive gear was ordinary, went quiet when she saw it. He gave her the boots, which were healer-type balanced and would actually suit her. He kept the chest piece and gauntlets. She said something about payment, about her family compensating him when they reached the exit. He told her the EXP buff was enough. She stopped talking about payment after that. They moved through the dungeon's third zone with a rhythm that settled quickly. Yun King stayed 2 steps behind his left shoulder, close enough to keep her buff in range, far enough to stay clear of whatever he was doing with the sword. She learned that gap without being told, adjusting after the first encounter where she'd crowded forward and nearly caught a ricochet off a stonehide lizard's shell. After that, she read his movements and matched them, which told him something useful about her instincts. The EXP numbers were significant. Her buff doubled the base rate, and Suming was killing fast enough that the doubling compounded into totals that should have taken days of grinding. He watched his level counter tick upward with the quiet satisfaction of someone executing a plan that was working exactly as designed. Then he heard the screaming. It came from the northwest, which was the direction most students from Xuanjing had entered the zone. A single voice first, then another, then a sound that wasn't quite screaming, the flat, percussive crack of a large-scale skill striking multiple targets at once. He knew that sound. He had heard it from an opponent who'd used it against him in his first life, on a different floor in a different dungeon, and the memory of it was sharp. Li Chengguang, the red-haired blade berserker from Wang City Academy, was running a quest. Not a dungeon quest, a personal one. The kind available only to students at certain talent thresholds. Hunt 30 Xuanjing students, take their dungeon tokens, and claim a tiered reward from the quest system. It was brutal and legal under the dungeon's rules, since the first dungeon ran revival conditions. Students who died here would be returned to their academy alive once the run ended. But legal didn't mean painless. Being hunted through a dungeon by an 8-star Blade Berserker while you were still a new student on your first run left marks that had nothing to do with physical wounds. Chen Guang was arrogant in the specific way of someone who had been gifted so much natural talent that they had never really needed to earn anything. He hunted weaker students not because the quest rewards demanded it, but because the gap in power made it easy, and easy things felt like proof. He had done the same thing in Suming's first life, and the students he'd broken on that run had dropped out within months. Suming moved northwest. Yun King kept up without asking where they were going. He smelled the aftermath before he saw it. Burnt ozone from electrical skills, the particular sharp scent of shattered stone where a force technique had punched through solid rock. The path opened into a clearing that had been a campsite 20 minutes ago. 3 students sat against a broken tree, 2 of them holding each other upright, one of them simply staring at her hands. Their gear was damaged, their tokens were gone. Chen Guang was still in the clearing. He stood with his back to the trees on the far side, sword drawn, looking at something Suming couldn't see from the entry point. He was tall, with crimson hair tied back from his face, wearing a full set of Academy-issued gold-grade gear that had been modified at the joints. Custom work, expensive, the kind of thing you brought to a school dungeon when you wanted everyone to know the dungeon was not a threat to you. The something he was looking at was Gi Yao. She had backed against a boulder at the clearing's edge, her hands up, a small wind-type barrier flickering around her that she was clearly struggling to maintain. It was a support skill, not a combat one, and Chen Guang had already assessed it as worthless against him. He was talking to her in the easy voice of someone who had decided the outcome and was simply enjoying the formality of the remaining seconds. Suming didn't announce himself. He sent the sword from the tree line. It crossed the clearing at the angle he'd calculated, not at Chen Guang, who would simply deflect it, but between Chen Guang and Gi Yao, the blade planting itself in the boulder just above her shoulder, with a sharp crack that made her flinch and made Chen Guang step back from pure reflex. A half-second of space. Enough. He dropped from the tree branch he'd climbed while the sword was crossing the clearing, landed between them, and caught the sword as it pulled free from the stone. Chen Guang looked at him. The easy voice was gone. What replaced it was a colder register. Not anger, but the focused attention of someone recalibrating. He asked who Suming was. 1-star, sword controller, no reputation, no guild backing, no business being in this part of the zone. He said it the way a person reads a receipt aloud, itemizing it. Suming said nothing. He watched Chen Guang's shoulder. He knew Chen Guang's tells from his first life. The shoulder dropped slightly before the first strike, a habit so ingrained that Chen Guang probably couldn't feel it himself anymore. The strike, when it came, was fast. Genuinely fast. The kind of speed that would have connected with almost any other student at this level, and it went through empty air. Suming wasn't there. What stood in his place was a figure with the same outline, same posture, the same sword held the same way. Shadow clone? A spatial technique that projected a duplicate at the point of departure, while the user moved to a new position. It lasted 4 seconds and could absorb 1 hit before dissolving. Chen Guang's blade carved through it and the figure came apart like smoke. Suming was behind him, not the dramatic theatrical behind, not pressed against his spine for a killing blow. Simply positioned at his rear quarter, sword extended in a guard stance, platinum armor catching the filtered dungeon light. He let Chen Guang turn and see the gear. Let him clock the difference between what he'd assessed 30 seconds ago and what was standing in front of him now. Chen Guang's expression worked through something. The math was visible on his face. 1-star, trash tier, shouldn't be wearing platinum, shouldn't have that technique, shouldn't have reached this zone this fast or evaded that strike. The numbers didn't resolve. He stared at the platinum chest piece and the calm face above it and felt the edge of something he hadn't felt in a long time. He drew a small hexagonal tablet from his belt, a spatial exit item, single use, expensive enough that most students wouldn't bring one to a school dungeon because burning it represented a significant material loss. His hand hesitated over it for just a moment. Then he activated it and disappeared. The clearing was quiet. Ji Yao let her barrier drop. She looked at where Cheng Guang had been, then at Su Ming, and her expression cycled through relief and confusion, and something softer that she didn't try to name. He asked if she was injured. She said she was fine, and then immediately disproved it by sitting down heavily against the boulder, her legs giving out now that the adrenaline was draining. He waited while she collected herself. He had time. In his first life, she had been the only one who'd stood by him when the last dungeon fell apart and everything else dissolved. She had not been a powerful fighter or a strategic asset. She was a win-type support with modest talent who simply chose, every time it cost her something, to stay. He had not understood what that meant until the moment she died for it. He understood now. He told her to stay with Yun King and keep moving toward the zone's center. He had something to finish. The thing he had to finish was the dungeon's hidden quest. Most students would clear the beginner zone without knowing the hidden quest existed. It didn't appear in any academy guide or guild documentation. It was a secret mechanic, one of several that the dungeon system embedded without advertising, available only to students who found and solved the environmental triggers that unlocked it. Su Ming had never found it in his first life, but he had learned about it afterward, from sources that no longer existed and couldn't be consulted again. He knew what it required, what it rewarded, and why nobody else in the current run would attempt it. The trigger was a dark lake in the dungeon's lowest zone, reachable through a passage most students marked on their maps as a dead end and avoided. The lake had no visible bottom. At its center, something moved just beneath the surface, a slow, circular motion, like water being pulled by an invisible drain. He reached it alone, having told Yun King and Gi Yao to wait at the zone's staging area. The environmental riddles were physical, not textual. The lake responded to specific actions in sequence. A sword strike into the water at the marked angle, a directed pulse of energy held for 3 seconds, and then a waiting period while the water read the input. He had committed the sequence to memory years ago in a conversation he could not have again, and he worked through it without hesitation, his hands steady, the dungeon's ambient sound dropping around him as if the zone itself was paying attention. The water stilled. Then it began to spin. The whirlpool opened slowly, a dark funnel dropping into the lake's center, and from somewhere beneath it came a sound like metal on metal, rhythmic and enormous. The sound grew. The water climbed the walls of the funnel in sheets, and the air pressure in the cavern changed, and then the boss came up through the opening, massive, armored, mounted on something mechanical that looked like a horse built from black steel plates with fire in the joints. The rider was a knight in sealed plate armor that covered every surface, carrying a lance that crackled with something blue and electrical where the tip met the air. It was taller than 3 men stacked upright. Its horse's hooves struck the water's surface and didn't sink. S-rank hidden boss. The ledger in Su Ming's memory called it the Iron Sovereign. He had planned for this. He keyed the comm stone he'd given Yun King before splitting off from the group, a small item that allowed short-range voice contact, and told her the coordinates, told her what was coming, told her the one thing that mattered. The horse had to be grounded before the knight could be effectively engaged, and grounding the horse required a sustained pulse to the fire joints at its knees, which were the only exposed points in its armor plating. She understood support class instructions. She relayed them to Gi Yao. They arrived fast, faster than he expected, which meant Yun King had started moving the moment he'd spoken. Gi Yao's wind skill was not a combat tool, but directed at a mechanical target's legs, it became something adjacent to one, a sustained force applied at exactly the joints Su Ming had identified. Not damage, disruption. The horse staggered, its fire joints sputtering, one foreleg buckling for a half-second before it caught itself. That half-second was enough. The knight came off the mount at a graceless angle, the lance tip dragging through the water, and Su Ming was already moving into the gap. Fighting the Iron Sovereign on the ground was still not a simple affair. It recovered its footing faster than he would have liked, and the lance had a reach that forced him to stay in constant motion, never settling into a stable position for more than a breath. He took a grazing hit across his left side that the platinum chest piece absorbed mostly, but mostly was doing significant work there, and he felt the impact spread through his ribs in a way that would be a problem in an hour. He fought through it. The sword worked at distance while his body worked at close range. A split-focus technique that cost concentration to maintain and felt like trying to write 2 different sentences simultaneously with 2 different hands. The knight tracked the sword, and the sword tracked the knight, and Suming moved in the spaces between. 3 minutes of real combat, not the clean instant kill variety. 3 minutes of a fight where the outcome was never certain until it suddenly was. The knight finally overextending on a downward lance strike, the tip burying itself in the cavern floor, and Suming at its neck joint with the blade before it could wrench free. The system notification was different from a normal kill. The font was larger, the reward text was longer, job change quest complete. Sword controller upgraded. New designation, Sword God. He stood in the cavern with water dripping from the stalactites, ribs aching, and let the information settle. 10-star mythic talent, now matched by a mythic class. In his previous life he had earned this at the end of everything, when it no longer had the time to matter. In this life he was still a student, with a fake trash tier ranking and a full academy dungeon run still technically in progress. He walked back to where Yun King and Gi Yao were waiting. Yun King stared at him, her eyes moving from the platinum gear to the sword to his face, and he could see her working through the same arithmetic Cheng Guang had tried and failed to resolve. Ji Yao looked at him the way she had always looked at him, without calculation, without ledger work, just glad that he was standing. He told them to move toward the exit. The dungeon had a leaderboard to settle. They reached the exit at the dungeon's northern boundary with 40 minutes left on the run timer. The staging area outside the gate was crowded in the specific way of people who had survived something and were still processing it. Students from half a dozen academies sat in loose clusters on the stone steps and the grass beyond, some still in damaged gear, some wrapped in emergency heal patches from the medic stations the proctors had set up at the perimeter. The noise was a low, uneven hum. Conversations too tired to be loud, a few people crying quietly, someone at the edge of the group retching from skill exhaustion. The leaderboard pillar stood at the center of the staging area, a tall, flat column that broadcast rankings in real time. The top name had been sitting at number 1 since 6 minutes into the run, and nobody had come close to it. Suming walked past the medic stations without stopping. A proctor intercepted him at the pillar's base. A middle-aged woman with the clipped efficiency of someone who had run dozens of these events and rarely saw anything that surprised her. She looked at the platinum gear, the S-rank notation beside his name on the board, and the calm in his face, and asked him to confirm his student ID for the record. He confirmed it. She wrote something in her ledger and stepped aside. The score attached to his name was not close. It was the kind of gap that made people look twice, then look at the person beside them, then look back. Solo mutant boss kill, full cavern clear, elite mob chain, hidden boss completion. A category that had a blank beside it for every other student in the run because the hidden quest's existence wasn't in any guide and nobody else had found the trigger. The S-rank notation glowed at the top of the column in a gold that was noticeably different from the silver and blue of the students ranked below. Principal Wang was at the staging area. He had come in person, which told Suming how much pressure the academy had been carrying into this run. He was a compact man with a habitually worried expression that had been doing something different for the last several minutes. A kind of cautious brightness, like someone who had been told good news and hadn't fully decided to believe it. He found Suming in the crowd and crossed to him with a speed that was slightly undignified for a principal. He said Suming had put Xuanjing first on the regional ranking board. He said it simply and then stood there, apparently needing a moment to hear how it sounded. From across the staging area, the principal of Wang City Academy was having a different kind of moment. He had arrived 40 minutes ago with the specific energy of a man expecting a good day. Li Chengguang was his student, 8-star Blade Berserker, the obvious top performer in any first-year run, and Wang's ranking had been comfortably above Xuanjing's for 3 consecutive seasons. He had been doing the quiet arithmetic of someone who expects a result to confirm what they already believe. The board told him something else. He looked at the S rank beside Suming's name for a long time. He looked at the first-place marker beside Xuanjing Academy. He looked for Li Chengguang's name and found it in the upper middle of the board, a strong result by ordinary standards, nothing close to first. He stood very still. Suming didn't look at him. He didn't need to. Principal Wang was saying something about Tower Society tokens, about the reward process, about the guild scouts already requesting contact information from the top scorers. Suming listened with part of his attention and let the rest of it rest. His ribs still ached from the lance hit. He would need to deal with that before the tower. The revival announcement came from the chief proctor 20 minutes later. She stood on the staging platform with a communication stone amplifying her voice and told the assembled students what Suming already knew. The beginner dungeon had operated under controlled revival conditions from the start. The students who had fallen during the run, the ones whose friends were sitting on those steps holding their knees and staring at nothing, would be returned to the academy by nightfall, alive and uninjured. The deaths in the dungeon had been real enough to feel but not permanent. The reaction moved through the crowd in a wave. Relief, first, enormous and physical. People grabbed each other. Someone laughed in a pitch that wasn't quite right yet. A girl covered her face with both hands and her shoulders shook. Then, behind the relief, something more complicated. The knowledge that the fear had been real, the pain had been real, the moment of watching a friend go down had been real, and the system had decided all of it was an acceptable condition for a tutorial. Students who hadn't known began to understand the shape of the world they had just entered. Suming had known since before the run started. He had said nothing, because saying it would have raised questions he didn't want to answer about how he knew. He stood in the crowd and watched the wave of feeling move through it, and felt the distance between himself and the people around him in a way that was not loneliness, but was adjacent to it. Ji Yao found him in the crowd and stood beside him without speaking. That was her way. She didn't fill silences with noise just because the silence was there. He was aware of her beside him the way you were aware of warmth, peripherally but genuinely. She said she was glad he was okay. He said he knew. She laughed, a small sound, and he felt something in the region of his chest that the platinum armor hadn't quite managed to protect. The Tower Society token was a bronze disc the size of a palm, engraved with a repeating pattern that Suming had always thought looked like a maze seen from above. It arrived via the reward system directly, deposited into his inventory tab without ceremony. The tower was a separate structure from the Academy dungeon system, a permanent installation, 100 floors of escalating difficulty that students could enter at designated times to earn resources, experience, and guild visibility. The orientation session was scheduled for the following morning. He attended, because not attending would have drawn attention. He sat in the back of the lecture hall while the tower proctor explained the entry mechanics, the floor structure, the rule about forfeiting above a certain difficulty threshold to avoid unnecessary deaths. The proctor was thorough and the information was accurate, and Suming already knew all of it, which meant his attention was elsewhere, specifically on the row of chairs along the lecture hall's western wall that the proctor had directed everyone away from. They were ordinary chairs. Old ones, slightly mismatched, pushed against the wall, as if they'd been there for years and nobody had bothered to move them. The proctor had gestured at the row when directing students to their seats and said something vague about reserved seating that most people heard as maintenance or administrative use. Suming looked at the chairs and kept his expression neutral. They were entry nodes. In the tower's actual mechanics, the ones not written in any student guide, the chairs along the western wall of the orientation hall were physical connection points to the tower's first-floor spawn room. They predated the current entry terminal by about 30 years, a legacy system that had never been fully decommissioned because decommissioning old tower architecture was complicated and expensive, and nobody had gotten around to it. They still worked. You could sit in one, place your tower token on the armrest, and be logged into the tower's first floor before the official entry session opened. He waited until the proctor's attention was on the front of the room and the students around him were occupied with their orientation packets. He moved to the western wall and sat down. Nobody looked at him. The token touched the armrest. The system responded. The first floor of the tower was a puzzle room, a wide stone chamber with a single exit door and a series of environmental clues arranged around a central object. The object was a glass case containing a bird. The puzzle required identifying the bird species correctly to open the door. Most students who reached this floor legitimately would spend 20 minutes on it. Some would spend an hour. The tower's puzzle logic rewarded lateral thinking over raw power, and the first floor was designed to filter students who couldn't operate outside combat metrics. The bird was a chicken. He knew this because in his first life he had eventually worked out that the tower's puzzle designer had a specific sense of humor about what constituted an educational challenge, and because a live chicken in a glass case in a fantasy dungeon was genuinely funny in the way that things were funny when you had enough distance to appreciate them. He spoke the answer into the room's input interface, the door opened, and he started climbing. The floors passed. By the time the official entry session opened and the other Tower Society students began appearing on the first floor, Suming was already past floor 10. The floor 10 bonus, a reward cache available to the first student to clear that floor in each session, was sitting in his inventory, a quality material component and a substantial coin bonus that would matter for what he needed to do next. Li Chengguang arrived at floor 10 with the specific look of someone who had not expected to be second. He stood in the floor 10 chamber, staring at the cleared completion marker, and the math was clearly bothering him again. The same arithmetic failure he'd experienced in the dungeon clearing, the same inability to make the numbers work. A one-star sword controller should not be ahead of him anywhere. The evidence kept contradicting the assessment. He looked around the chamber as if Suming might still be visible somewhere nearby. Suming was 4 floors above him. He forfeited at floor 20. This wasn't defeat, it was precision. The boss on floor 20 was a creature designed to be cleared by students significantly above his current level. A guardian entity whose strength scaled upward of level 35, and Suming was 20. Fighting it was not viable. Fighting it badly was a waste of resources, and potentially a waste of things more important than resources. But he had approached it first. He had reached the chamber, analyzed the boss's mechanics for 2 full minutes, and let the boss see him doing it. The Guardian registered his intent, read his level, and did something that tower bosses rarely did for students who forfeited. It paused. The Guardian class in the tower system was not unintelligent. They had something adjacent to judgment, a capacity to assess challengers and decide whether a forfeit was weakness or wisdom. A student who forfeited at floor 5 because they were scared was not the same as a student who reached floor 20 at level 20, read the encounter correctly, identified the gap, and chose to come back when the gap was closed. The Guardian dropped a diamond-grade item before Suming had fully exited the chamber. He picked it up without breaking stride. Diamond grade meant it sat 2 tiers above platinum, the highest item quality most academy students would see in their first year, the kind of equipment that mid-tier guild hunters work toward. He turned it in his hands once in the exit corridor, cataloged it against what he knew he'd need over the next month, and kept walking. Downstairs, the official session was running. Students were spread across the early floors, some in parties, some solo, working through the tower's incremental challenges with the cautious energy of people encountering something new. He moved through them like a current through still water, going in the opposite direction. In the tower's lobby, he checked his coin total. Between the dungeon bonus, the Yang Ding wager, the floor 10 reward, and the diamond item's projected sale value, he had a working capital he hadn't expected to assemble this quickly. There were things he needed to do with it, and the order mattered. First among them was a name he'd been carrying in the back of his mind since the awakening ceremony, a person he had seen in his first life only from a distance, at a point when her significance was already obvious, but also already too late for him to act on. Her forge shop was on the academy's outer commercial strip, sandwiched between a potion vendor and a leather goods stall, and it was easy to overlook. The sign was faded. The display window held 3 items, all of them modest in construction, nothing that would pull a serious buyer off the street. The woman inside was young, younger than her station implied, with the slightly hollowed look of someone who had been working long hours on narrow margins. Her name was Nahula. She was repairing a bronze-grade sword when he came in, the blade clamped in a small vise on her workbench, her attention entirely on a hairline crack running through the steel near the guard. She had a set of tools laid out with the precision of someone who couldn't afford to lose any of them. The shop smelled like coal ash and metal polish and something faintly herbal, a flux compound she was mixing herself rather than buying pre-made, because pre-made was more expensive. She looked up when the door opened. Her expression shifted into the neutral readiness of a merchant who had learned not to assume a customer meant a sale. He told her he wanted to commission a weapon upgrade. Not today, over a period of months, iterative, with specific material requirements at each stage. He named the materials. He knew the sequence because in his first life he had watched the weapon she eventually produced become one of the most sought-after blades in the hunter market, and he had traced it backward from the result to understand what inputs had made it possible. The sequence was specific and unusual, and not something she would have arrived at on her own timeline for at least another 2 years. She stared at him. He placed a coin transfer on the counter. Half up front, the remainder paid in installments as work progressed. The total was enough to keep the shop running without the margin anxiety for 6 months, and buy the raw materials she'd need without substituting cheaper alternatives. She looked at the coins. She looked at him. She looked at his academy insignia, which identified him as a student, which in the commercial strip context meant she was looking at a first-year Hunter Academy student, placing a commission that mid-tier guild hunters would have considered generous. She asked what he wanted in return. He said a 30% discount, permanent, on anything he purchased from her from this point forward. She said that was very low compensation for the scale of the commission. He said he knew. He said he was a patient investor. She accepted. The agreement registered in the system's commerce ledger, and he left the shop while she was still looking at the coin total, with an expression caught between relief and the particular suspicion of someone who had been careful for so long that generosity registered as a threat. He didn't explain the investment logic to her. She would understand it eventually, in years, when the weapon sequence he'd mapped out produced something that rewrote her reputation in the craft entirely. He would be there to collect on the discount, and the discount would be worth considerably more than what he'd paid today. The Mirage Zone opened 3 days later. It was the wilderness region that separated the human settlements from the deep monster territories. Not a dungeon, not a controlled environment, but actual terrain with actual consequences. Permanent death rules applied. The Academy sent students in for ranked hunts, specific targets, assigned grades, point rewards for confirmed kills. It was the first encounter most students had with a world that didn't run revival conditions underneath it. Suming's assigned hunt was a D-rank Python kill. The Python variants in the Mirage Zone's outer band were large but slow, manageable targets for a student at his level, assuming you approach them with basic tactical sense. The Academy paired him with a small group for the trip to the zone boundary, then students split off for individual hunts once they reached the designated area. He separated from the group quickly and moved into the outer band alone. The Mirage Zone was not quiet in the way that felt peaceful. It was quiet in the way of places that had learned economy. Every sound purposeful, nothing wasted. The ambient noise reduced to exactly the information that mattered. Wind through dry grass. Something moving in the tree line at a distance. The distant lower register of large creatures doing what large creatures did when they weren't disturbed. He found something else before he found the python. She was in a shallow ravine 30 meters off the main hunting path, wedged into a space between two boulders, and she was so still that he almost missed her. The fact that he didn't miss her was partly his appraisal ability passively scanning the environment and partly the specific way she was breathing, fast and shallow, the pattern of someone holding terror down with both hands. She was small, young, probably around his age or slightly under. Catfolk, a humanoid type with faint feline features, small rounded ears visible through dark hair that had been recently and badly cut, a tail curled tight against her legs. Her clothes were hunter-grade in construction, but too large, clearly not fitted for her, the kind of thing you grabbed when the alternative was nothing. She had a short knife in one hand that she was gripping with the concentrated desperation of someone who had made peace with the fact that it wasn't enough, but was holding it anyway. Level 3. He could see it in the system scan without her knowing he was looking. He stopped at the ravine's edge and crouched down so he wasn't silhouetted against the sky, which would have made any nearby creature aware of his position and would have made her more afraid than she already was. He said he wasn't a threat. She stared at him with the flat attention of something that has assessed too many threats recently to respond to words without more evidence. He sat down on the boulder's edge and waited, not performing patience, actually waiting, giving her the time to decide. He had found in his first life that certain kinds of trust couldn't be argued into existence. They had to be allowed to arrive at their own speed. After a minute, she shifted, not relaxing, adjusting, the knife still in her hand, but the angle of her body changing from braced to watchful. She told him about the python. Not the D-rank target he was hunting, a different one, a larger variant that had been moving through this section of the outer band for 2 days. She told him what it had done to the group she'd been traveling with, the other orphan hunters who had come into the Mirage Zone together because there was safety in numbers and because there was nowhere else. She told him what the python had done with her flat voice of someone who had finished processing the event into the past tense because the present tense version of it was unmanageable. Her name was Leah. She was alone now. He listened without interrupting. He told her when she finished that he was going to find the python and kill it. He told her she could stay in the ravine or she could come with him and maintain distance while he worked. He said both options were valid. She came with him. She maintained the distance he'd specified with the same instinctive spatial reading Yun King had shown in the dungeon. The ability to follow someone without crowding them, to occupy a position that was useful rather than problematic. The python's trail was not difficult to find when you knew what you were looking for. A creature of that size displaced vegetation in a particular way and left a thermal signature that Suming's appraisal tracked passively. He followed it for 20 minutes, moving carefully, and what he found when he located the creature's current resting position changed the immediate plan. The python was enormous, well above D rank in scale, which meant it was either a regional variant or a dungeon-adjacent mutant that had drifted into the outer band. It was coiled around a depression in the ground between 3 large trees, its body thick as a load-bearing column, and it was asleep. The ambient sound of its breathing moved the grass in a 2-meter radius around its head. He was assessing his approach angle when the first assassin appeared. Not a monster, a person. The attack came from above, a compressed ice lance, fired from a position in the canopy that Suming had not flagged because the shooter had used a concealment technique that his passive scan hadn't immediately resolved. The lance was a homing type. Once fired, it tracked to the target's last confirmed location and adjusted mid-flight. A serious skill, the kind used by professional tier hunters, not students. The shooter was not a student. He moved left. The lance adjusted. He moved again, harder, changing vector rather than speed, and the lance clipped the air beside his shoulder before burying itself in a tree trunk. Ice bloomed from the impact point and climbed the bark in a pale web. 2 more figures dropped from the trees, one east, one north, forming a loose triangle around him. 3 assassins, their gear unmarked, their faces covered. The system scan returned their levels, 23, 25, 27. He was 20. The level gap sat just inside the threshold, under 10 in each case, which meant under the world's player kill penalty rule. They had calculated this deliberately. He knew who had sent them without needing to verify it. Jiang Tang, the 8-star student who had once been his best friend, and had decided that an orphan with a 1-star trash rating, finishing ahead of him on the dungeon leaderboard, was a problem that warranted a professional solution. Tang didn't know what Suming actually was. He had simply seen an anomaly and applied resources to it. The 3 assassins moved to close the triangle. Suming took a breath and stopped retreating. He looked at the sleeping python. He looked at the ice lance still embedded in the tree behind him, frost still spreading from the point of impact. He looked at the assassin who had fired it, the highest level one, 27, who was now moving through the canopy to get a second angle. The homing lance was a triggered skill, fire it at a target, and it tracked. The targeting system was not intelligent. It used the initial lock, held through the flight path, and impacted whatever the lock resolved to. He considered the geometry. He waited for the second lance. When it came, he was standing 6 feet from the python's head. The lance was already in the air. He moved, not away from the python, toward it, stepping over the coiled body in one motion, breaking the lock's line of sight for exactly long enough. The lance adjusted, found the closest warm body in the original target vector, and drove itself into the python's skull. The snake woke up angry. What followed was not quiet. The python's initial reaction was blind violence. A body that large moving with that much force created a radius of pure chaos. Trees cracking, the ground shaking, the assassins scrambling to get clear of the thrashing. The shooter in the canopy dropped badly, catching a branch on the way down, landing off balance. The 2 ground-level assassins broke their formation to avoid the tail. The triangle dissolved in 4 seconds. Suming was already outside the kill radius, watching from 20 meters back, with Leah pressed behind a boulder beside him. She had moved the moment he'd moved, without instruction, which confirmed something he'd been tentatively thinking about her. The python and the assassins found each other. It was not an equal contest. The python was enraged and enormous, and operating entirely on instinct, and 2 of the assassins were already injured from the initial chaos, and the third, the shooter, had landed badly and was slow to recover his footing. They used skills. The python absorbed them with the indifference of something whose body mass made most attack-tier spells feel like weather. It was not invulnerable, but it was large enough to treat serious damage as a cost of doing business rather than a reason to stop. The fight lasted 9 minutes. Suming tracked it from his position, reading the outcome probabilities, waiting. When the dust resolved, 2 of the assassins were dead. The python was severely wounded, its movement slowed, one side of its body dragging. The third assassin, the highest level one, the shooter, was alive but finished, kneeling on the ground with something broken in his posture that went beyond the physical. Suming stepped forward. He dealt with the python cleanly, a single directed strike to the already damaged skull. The system logged the kill as his. The final blow rule applied regardless of who had done the preceding work. Then he turned to the assassin. The man looked up at him. He was trying to calculate, Suming could see it. running some version of the arithmetic that people ran when they were trying to find the exit from a situation that had run out of exits. He had a blade still in his hand, technically. He had a skill or two remaining, probably. He was doing the math on whether any combination of those things added up to survival. Suming told him calmly that he was going to explain what paralysis skill he was holding in reserve, because the muscle tension in his left hand indicated a charge-type ability, and a charge-type ability in his position was clearly being saved for a last resort, rather than used offensively. He said that if the man activated it, the next few minutes would go differently than he was imagining. The assassin's face changed. Not the face change of someone calling a bluff, the face change of someone hearing their own hand read back to them with perfect accuracy by the person they'd been sent to kill. He said he was done. Suming stepped forward and finished it. He did not hesitate and he did not explain himself. The calculus was simple, and he had done it already. Professional assassins did not stop because a job failed. They regrouped, reported, and came back better prepared. Leaving one alive was not mercy. It was an appointment. He straightened up, cleaned the blade on the grass, and turned to where Leah was standing by the boulder. She was watching him with the careful attention of someone revising a model. She had seen him fight in the dungeon-adjacent style against the Python and against the first two assassins' peripheral chaos, and now she had seen something different, the still, deliberate quality of someone who killed without agitation. She didn't look frightened of him. She looked like she was figuring out something true. He said she'd done well, staying out of the radius, moving when he moved, not freezing. She said she'd had practice not freezing. He believed her. The outer band of the Mirage Zone had gone quiet again. That specific settling quiet, the kind that followed something violent, where even the ambient creatures had pressed themselves into stillness and were waiting to decide if the disturbance was over. Suming stood in the aftermath and ran the arithmetic one more time. 3 assassins. He had counted 3 from the moment the first lance had come through the canopy, and the triangle formation confirmed it. 3 points, 3 shooters, a standard professional containment pattern. He had watched all 3 die. The Python's kill, confirmed. The third, his own. The problem was the number 3 itself. In his first life, Zhang Tang had been impulsive but not stupid. He had been the kind of person who studied risk and applied resources until the risk looked managed. Sending 3 assassins into the Mirage Zone to handle an anomaly was reasonable. Sending exactly 3 was the kind of precision that came from a person who believed 3 was sufficient. But Suming had learned something in his first life that Tang hadn't. Sufficiency was a trap. The people who succeeded were the ones who added one more than sufficient. One more layer, one more check, one more contingency. He stayed still. He made a small, deliberate movement, reaching down to clean the blade on the grass a second time, even though it was already clean, and watched the tree line with his peripheral vision while his eyes stayed on his hands. Nothing moved. He straightened and took 3 steps toward Leah. The paralysis hit him between the second and third step. It came from below, not the trees, the ground. A rune embedded in the earth that had been waiting for him to enter its trigger radius. It spread up from his feet in under a second, a cold locking sensation that traveled his nervous system and shut down voluntary movement from the ankles upward, in a wave that he felt reaching his shoulders, before he could complete the thought to react to it. He stopped moving. Not fell, stopped, his body held upright by the skill's own tension, frozen mid-stride. His sword arm was locked at his side. Leah made a sound. Cut it off immediately, which was the right instinct. The 4th assassin stepped out of the ground. Not metaphorically, a concealment technique that used terrain phasing, pressing the body into a shallow layer beneath the surface, and holding it there until the trigger activated. He rose from the earth 6 meters away, brushing dirt from his sleeves with the calm of someone who had been waiting comfortably. He was different from the other 3. Older, for one thing. The others had been hired professionals in the mid-level range. Competent, but operating within the normal bracket of contract work. This one had the specific stillness of someone whose stillness was a practiced professional skill rather than a natural temperament. He moved without waste. He scanned the clearing once, confirmed the 3 dead bodies, and looked at Suming with an expression that contained something close to professional approval. He said the paralysis rune was rated for 40 minutes. He said the seal on the skill was total. Movement, speech, manual technique. He said Suming had been better than expected, genuinely, which was the kind of compliment that was also a threat. Suming couldn't move his hands. He couldn't speak. His sword hung at his side, useless. He could think. The paralysis was a charge sustain type, which the assassin had already indicated by mentioning the 40-minute rating. Charge sustain skills drew from a reservoir rather than a constant feed, which meant their seal had a consistency mechanic. Consistent pressure held the lock, inconsistent pressure, a spike, a disruption to the skill's ambient channel, created a window. Small, possibly fractions of a second, but a window. The assassin was not stupid enough to be baited by a simple distraction. He knew his skill. He knew what it did, but he didn't know what Suming knew about it. Suming spoke, not out loud. The seal locked his throat as completely as his hands. But the appraisal function worked through cognition rather than movement, and while it couldn't project externally, it could process. He worked through everything he knew about charge-sustained paralysis mechanics, the specific version, the tier, the observable indicators of how this one was being maintained, and he built a picture. Then he used the one thing the seal hadn't locked, his eyes. He looked at Leah. Not a glance, a directed look, the kind with specific content. She was 8 meters behind him and to his left, outside the rune's trigger radius, which the assassin had also assessed and filed as irrelevant. A level 3 catfolk girl, with a knife too large for her hands, was not a variable in this equation. That was the assassin's arithmetic. Suming had different arithmetic. He looked at Leah and moved his eyes twice to the left, then down, then left again. The same motion, the same direction, twice over. She was watching him with complete attention. He had noted this about her from the moment she'd come out of the ravine. The quality of her attention was not what a level 3 orphan in a survival situation should have produced. She read environments the way someone did when reading environments had been the difference between alive and not alive for long enough that it had become instinctive. She looked where he looked. The fourth assassin was watching Suming's face and had not tracked the eye movement to Leah, because Leah was a non-variable, and tracking a non-variable was below the threshold of his professional attention. Leah moved. She didn't attack. She was not equipped or leveled to attack someone of his caliber, and she knew it. She did something more precise. She kicked a loose rock at the edge of the clearing, a flat stone the size of her fist, and it skipped across the ground with a rattling sound that hit multiple surfaces on its path, producing a directional confusion that made it impossible to immediately locate the source. The assassin's attention broke. Half a second, maybe less. The channel disrupted. Suming moved his right hand 4 inches. The sword lifted. Not far. 4 inches was the full extent of what the weakened seal allowed before it re-established. And re-establish it did, clamping back down on his arm with a force that pushed the movement into stillness again. But 4 inches was enough for the sword's tip to clear the ground, and a sword controlled by spatial technique didn't need a full arm swing to function. The blade rotated. The assassin registered the movement and stepped back. The instinctive step of someone who knew what a controlled blade could do and had gotten too close. His step back put him at 7 meters instead of 6. Suming spoke. His throat had been locked. The seal was weakened but not broken, and speaking required the seal to be broken, which it wasn't. What he produced was not speech. It was a sound, a controlled exhalation with consonant shapes, enough to approximate words if the listener was close enough and attentive enough to fill the gaps from context. He told the assassin he had read the seal's mechanic. He told him the rune had a frequency signature he could feel through the sword's resonance. He told him the window Leah had opened had been enough for him to map the vulnerability point and that his next attempt would not be 4 inches. The assassin stared at him. He was doing the math again. Suming could see it. The man had planned for a paralyzed target, a clean finish, a professional result. What he had instead was a paralyzed target who had just described his own skill mechanics back to him from inside the seal, while controlling a floating blade at reduced movement, while apparently coordinating with a child he'd classified as irrelevant. The math wasn't resolving. Suming watched the uncertainty work through the man's stillness, watched the professional composure develop its first crack. He told him, in those approximate sound shapes, forcing the words through the locked throat, that he had 2 choices. Move forward and find out if the read was accurate, or move back and trigger a different problem. The assassin moved forward. It was pride, ultimately. The same pride that had sent 3 professionals into the Mirage Zone confident in a formation that had worked before. He was better than the other 3. Suming had already assessed that, but better didn't mean immune to the specific failure mode of believing your own capability assessment over contradicting evidence. The seal's window came from pressure changes during movement. When the assassin stepped forward, his concentration redistributed. The minimal, almost unconscious redirect of attention that came with closing distance on an opponent who had just made a claim. The redistribution was tiny. The sword moved, not 4 inches this time. The disruption window was narrower on a forward step than a lateral one, but it was there, and Suming had mapped the exact point it would appear based on the 3 previous tests. The blade came up in a single arc, controlled entirely by spatial technique, no hand movement required beyond the initial vector assignment. The assassin had his own blade up. He caught most of it. Most. He went down and stayed down, and the paralysis seal dissolved as its source dropped, and Suming's body unlocked all at once. A sudden return of sensation that came with the pins and needles rush of circulation restored after compression. He stood still for a moment, letting his hands confirm they were his again. Leah was beside him before he'd fully recovered. She didn't say anything. She picked up the rock she'd kicked and turned it in her hands once, then set it down. He looked at her and said she had good instincts. She said someone had to. He almost smiled. The aftermath of the clearing had produced a different problem. 4 professional assassins and 1 oversized python in the Mirage Zone's outer band was not a quiet event. The level of skill use and the python's death throes had made noise, and noise in the Mirage Zone attracted attention. By the time Suming had searched the assassins' bodies for anything useful and confirmed the python kill with his system log, he could hear other hunters converging on the area from at least 2 directions. These were legitimate hunters, students from other academies and a few independent operators. Drawn by the commotion, they would arrive to find 4 dead humans and a dead D-rank adjacent python and a level 20 student standing in the middle of it. And the story that read from that scene was not a story he wanted to be telling. He had 3 minutes, maybe 4. He arranged the scene with the specific intent of a person who had thought about this kind of misdirection before. The bodies were moved into positions consistent with the python having killed them. Not perfectly. Nothing that would survive a forensic system scan, but enough to read correctly at a glance. The python itself was repositioned slightly to suggest it had died mid-attack, rather than from a clean finishing strike. Then he stood at the clearing's edge and waited. The hunters arrived in a loose cluster. 5 students, 2 independent operators with the slightly weathered look of people who'd been working the Mirage Zone long enough to be careful. They surveyed the clearing in the practiced way of people taking in information before committing to a reaction. Suming spoke first. He said he'd come across the aftermath of what looked like a python ambush, found the scene already settled, and moved to confirm the kill for his hunt record. He said it matter-of-factly, the tone of someone reporting an observation rather than narrating a cover story. The independent operators looked at the bodies. They looked at the python. They looked at Suming, specifically at the platinum gear, which was inconsistent with the tone he was projecting, and at his level, which was inconsistent with the platinum gear. One of them asked how a level 20 student had ended up with a diamond-tier sword at his hip. He'd missed that the Guardian had given him a weapon, not armor. Suming told him it was a tower reward and left it at that. The operator considered this for a long moment, doing exactly the kind of math that people in the Mirage Zone did when the numbers didn't quite add up, but the alternative to accepting the explanation was starting something with a person who was wearing platinum gear and standing calm in the center of 4 dead bodies. He nodded and moved on. The students filed in behind him, already losing interest in the clearing and shifting toward the python's carcass for the loot assessment. Suming walked out of the clearing with Leah beside him. She had stayed quiet through the performance and continued staying quiet until they were far enough into the tree line that the sound of the other hunters had dropped away. Then she said she wanted to come with him. Not as a partner. She was clear about the distinction, which he respected. As a student, she said she had watched him handle 4 professional assassins and a mutant python and a crowd of witnesses in under an hour, and she understood the difference between her level and his, and she wasn't asking to be treated as an equal. She was asking to be taught by someone who actually knew what they were doing, because the alternative was continuing to survive alone at level 3, in a zone where level 3 was a liability. She said she didn't want to be alone anymore. He looked at her for a moment. In his first life, he had refused offers like this, had operated alone by preference, had treated attachment as a structural weakness in a world where people's true motivations revealed themselves under pressure. He had been right about most of the people who made those offers. He had been catastrophically wrong about 2 of them, which had ended that life. Leah was not Ren Xiaoman. She was not performing anything. The request was exactly what it appeared to be. A person with nothing, asking for something real, making no pretense about the terms. He said she could come. She exhaled, a sound that had more weight in it than its volume suggested. They made their way back to the zone boundary as the afternoon light began its decline, the mirage zone settling into its pre-dusk register around them. He filed his hunt completion at the boundary checkpoint, confirmed the python kill, and noted Leah's presence as a sanctioned temporary companion, a bureaucratic category that the Mirage Zone's administration used for exactly this kind of situation, which he had known about from his first life and she had clearly not. She looked at the registration confirmation on the checkpoint screen with the expression of someone who had just been given an official document for the first time and was not entirely sure what to do with that. He told her to get some rest before they moved again. She sat down against the checkpoint wall and was asleep in 4 minutes. He watched the boundary for a while, then checked his system inventory. The python kill had logged. The assassin bodies would be found eventually. The zone's administrative system flagged unregistered deaths and sent a recovery team within 48 hours. The forensic scan would eventually produce a more complex picture than his scene arrangement had suggested. That was a problem for a future week, and a manageable one. What was not a problem was his current position. Level 20, climbing fast, with gear that outpaced his level, a skill set that most hunters wouldn't see until they were twice his age, and a running list of forward-dated knowledge that was already paying out exactly as he remembered it. He returned to the academy that evening. Leah was installed in temporary student housing through a process he navigated without asking anyone's permission, using the paperwork categories he knew existed and most administrative staff forgot about. His dormitory room was quiet when he reached it. He sat on the edge of the bed and pulled out the sword the Guardian had dropped at floor 20. Diamond grade, clean line, unusual balance point. The kind of weapon that was worth more sold than used at his current level. He turned it in his hands once and set it on the desk. A knock came at the door. It was a courier from the Jiang family's administrative office, Yun King's family, a name that moved through the upper tier of the hunter economy with the ease of long-established money. The courier handed him a flat case without ceremony and left. Inside the case was a sword. Gold grade, ornate, with a family seal inlaid at the base of the blade in a metal he didn't immediately identify. An attached card indicated it was a gift from the Jiang household, in gratitude for the aid rendered to Jiang Yun King during the beginner dungeon run. He held the gold-grade sword in one hand and the diamond-grade guardian sword in the other, and looked at both of them for a moment. The gold-grade one was the more valuable of the two on the open market, which was counterintuitive given the grade difference. The family seal and the specific smith's provenance made it a collector's piece rather than a combat tool, and collector's pieces moved for prices that combat tools at the same grade didn't approach. He had known the gift was coming. He had known it would be worth selling the moment it arrived. He set both swords on the desk beside each other. Between the two of them, liquidated at the right market contacts, which he knew, because in his first life he had sold equipment through those contacts for years, he would have enough to fund Nahula's next material acquisition stage and still keep a working surplus large enough to carry him through the next phase of leveling without scraping. He thought about the forge shop, the faded sign, the woman with the hollow look and the careful tools. He thought about what she would eventually make with the sequence he had given her, and what that sequence would mean for him when she completed it, and the long arc of patience that connected the coins on her counter today to the blade he'd eventually carry. He put the swords in his storage and lay back on the bed. Outside the window, the academy's night cycle was settling in. The distant sounds of students returning from various activities. A bell marking curfew at the east gate, the low ambient hum of the system's background processes that most people stopped noticing after their first week. Suming stared at the ceiling and didn't sleep for a while. He was thinking about Jiang Tang, about the 8-star student who had sent 4 professionals into the Mirage Zone and was currently somewhere in this academy, operating under the assumption that his problem had been handled. The assumption would hold until the recovery team filed its report, and the report would not immediately point to Suming. His scene arrangement had bought time, and the player kill rules created a legal complexity around the assassins themselves that would slow any investigation. But Tang would eventually know the hit had failed, and when he knew, he would recalculate. Suming had done his own recalculation already. The timeline he was running, the power leveling, the forge sponsorship, the tower climbing, the resource accumulation, was not simply about getting strong enough to survive. It was about getting strong enough fast enough that by the time Tang's recalculation produced a second attempt, the gap between them had become something that professional assassins couldn't bridge regardless of how many were sent. He had a head start that Tang didn't know about. He had knowledge Tang couldn't access and a skill set Tang couldn't measure and an artifact that the entire world had once tried to take from him. This time, he intended to still be holding it at the end. He closed his eyes. In the darkness behind them he saw, briefly, the dungeon floor of his first life. The specific quality of that light, the weight of the artifact in his hands, the sound of footsteps behind him that he had not thought to question. He let the image sit for a moment without moving toward it or away from it. Then he let it go the way you let go of something you've already decided about. Tomorrow he would sell the swords. He would check on Nahula's progress. He would begin mapping the next dungeon cycle with the information he carried, like a second skeleton inside his chest. Every hidden quest, every future spike, every move that needed to be made before the board shifted again. Jiang Tang had no idea who he was dealing with. Neither did Ren Xiaoman, currently carrying a scar she would spend the next year trying to explain to guild interviewers. Neither did Li Chengguang, somewhere in the tower, still running the arithmetic on how a one-star sword controller had beaten him to the floor 10 bonus. They all had the same picture of him, the orphan nobody, the garbage result, the one-star trash who had gotten lucky a few times and would eventually hit a ceiling and stop being interesting. He would let them keep it for a while longer. The ceiling, when they finally saw it, would not look like what they expected.